off the. Yeah, so my plan here was to do a pretty brief session, so probably hopefully around 20 or 30 minutes, just on covering. It's a bit of history and a bit of just placing the standards work that's going on with the working groups and the Spark Accelerator program, and how it relates to some of the standards that exist, and just some basics on navigating around the standards and specifications. Basically, there's going to be the aim is to do a session each month. We'll probably get into more detail around particular aspects as we go, but this is pretty much a high level. There's been a lot of questions from people about, what's an AU core, what's an AU base, how does this all hang together, what does it mean? So hopefully I can cover that stuff off, and we can get a bit of a overall picture. Some of this might not be news to you if you're heavily involved already. So I'll just feel free to come and go if you think it's if you think this is not really hitting the mark for you. Anyway, so I'll get this presented. Yeah. All right. Yeah, this is pretty informal, so please do have a conversation as well as we go. Yeah, I'm hoping also this is a nice way to meet people in the community as well, and get to know each other a bit as well. So I really just wanted to cover off the standards, all the HL7 FHIR standards that we're talking about, and the localization of that. There's a history of material that's sort of been produced over time, and it's actually very nice to see where this is all coming from. You might hear terms and versions and things that come up in discussion, and this might hopefully help place what we're going on about in some of this space. Certainly one thing to note is all of the FHIR standards come from HL7 International. So that's an international standards development organization. It has international members, so it's based in the US, but it's got members from all over the world. There's affiliate organizations that are running in different countries. HL7 Australia is the affiliate for Australia. So these are essentially independent entities that run as affiliates of HL7 International. The international standards work has produced the FHIR specifications. So that's been that's the collaborative piece that's been running over many years. So we're talking around 2011, 2012 was kind of when the FHIR story started. Graham Grieve, who's a Melbourne resident, it was kicked off that work, and it was really a reaction to some of the difficulties in implementing any health interoperability, especially in a modern sort of web-based sense. So the ability to do things that support mobile and a whole bunch of web-enabled technology was pretty difficult when the standard set was in place. So we're talking the clinical document architecture was previous version of HL7 standards, and HL7 version 2, which has a long history in interoperability. So the international FHIR standards went through various versions. So there has been a version 1, a version 2, a version 3, and version 4, and now we're up to version 5 of the standards. The early, basically, the versions 1 and 2 were marked as draft standards for trial use. The version 3 was marked as a standard for trial use. And once we got to R4, that was essentially marked as a normative version. So there's normative material contained in R4, and we go on to R5 as well. I'll talk a little bit. There is a 4B as well, which I'll talk about. But kind of in the Australian space, we've mainly been thinking about things in more detail around the FHIR STU3 standard initially. So we started to say, well, we should really have some localization of this international standard. The HL7 sort of standards have run through a sequence. R4 was the first normative version of the standard. 4B was an update to that that included some extra material, but is completely backwards compatible with R4. So that's noted as another version. There's things in 4B that don't exist in R4, but R4, all the things in R4 exist in 4B exactly. And we do have the R5 stream as well, which is the latest and current version of FHIR, which came out, when was that? That was this year. So, or late last year. So the work that's been going on in Australia has been, so this is all international work that runs with international committees. The international working groups meet 3 times a year, usually in the US, but sometimes other places in the world. And a lot of the work is done to resolve issues and build out the standards, through those meetings. There's one next week, in fact, in Phoenix, Arizona. So that's continuing work that happens all the time. There's calls and business going on to work on the international standards and international content. From the Australian side, we seriously started looking at saying how can we use and define things with against the international standards around the STU3 space. So we actually have a specification called AU base, which is but it's something that provides us an ability to reference the international standard and say this is here are some concepts and things that we understand are important in Australia, and I'll go through a bit of that in more detail about what that means in a sec. So we did have something based on STU3, which sort of let us build out models that were useful for Australian use. And this was more about guidance about things that we would want to commonly represent, but we didn't necessarily have that. There weren't specific details in the international standard because it's an international standard, and we had to sort of define our own way of doing some things in terms of how would we represent common things like Medicare numbers and how would we represent common things like Indigenous status. When the R4 version came out as well, we moved towards having an R4 version of the AU base, which provided some ability then to do this work with R4. When R4B came out as well, we actually get R4B for free. So we do have specifications for R4 and R4B built in the same specification. And one of the other things that happened around the HL7 Australia space was the provider directory project. So the provider directory project is actually a specific project built out to support the secure messaging business. So this was the aim to have a FHIR-based directory system that could be federated across all the main secure messaging vendors. So that was some ability then to find destinations to send secure messages across all the vendors, no matter what system was receiving the messages. So it became a sort of standardized way to find destinations to send messages and be able to achieve that. And it was chosen to use FHIR as the basic way of doing that, which includes how to represent a lot of Australian sort of provider details and organization details in a system, and being able to then query that across multiple federated sources. The sort of current round of things that are happening, and this is kind of, I guess, why most of you are here, is the Sparked FHIR Accelerator. So we're particularly looking at building out an AU core. So AU core relies on material in AU base. So there is a bit of to and fro in terms of what is needed. So we will probably find gaps and issues with AU based content. As we build out the AU core sort of definition, with that will get worked on and built up to the next versions of AU base, and also provide us then an AU core specification. I'm going to go through this in a little bit more detail about what the differences are between the specs and why there is an AU base in existence, and how that relates a bit to the AU core purpose. And we also have e-requesting on the cards as well in Sparked. We kind of expect that to be built on top of AU core. So there's definitely going to be work harmonizing those things as it goes forward as well. So the ability to be able to utilize AU core as part of the solution in e-requesting is important as well. And just to put a few things that don't entirely exist at the moment, some of you might have heard of the International Patient Summary, which is an international specification for a summary document sort of entity. The ability for us to sort of build an Australian version of that sort of patient summary concept is primarily going to be based on being able to get to the information we need, and one of the things we can use is AU core to help us find and get the information needed to build a patient summary together. So a common sort of capability with AU core gives us a standardized pathway really to be able to build out an Australian patient summary structure, because it'll become much more systematic in terms of the FHIR content, and being able to then build out things like patient summary and other sorts of implementation as well. As far as the future as well, we haven't yet really considered doing an R5 version of AU base, but that's certainly something that's on the cards, and we're kind of looking at how many people are interested in R5. The core work at the moment is really on R4. R4 is an active and quite well implemented standard across the world, so it has a lot of support in the community in general in terms of international implementation and so forth, and plenty of tools and useful off-the-shelf equipment as well. R5 will get there as well, but at the moment there's no pressing urge to move up to R5 at the moment, but that is something that may change, or maybe based on particular projects that need to happen, where material in R5 is important. There's certainly extra content in R5 that might be relevant for some kinds of business, which sort of leads us to say, do we need an R5 AU core version? And and that kind of gives us a pathway into the future about what things we might need to do. The good news is that when we're doing the hard and heavy lifting in AU core and building out the concepts and implementation, a lot of the translation into R5 of that material will be almost automatic. There's sort of clear pathways from AU, some of the AU core definitions into sort of R5 definitions, so R4 to R5. A lot of that material might actually be based on normative R4 content. So when resources in R4 are marked the normative, you can expect them to be the same in R5. There may be additional elements added, but basically they'll be completely backwards compatible. So there's some guarantee there on that you won't have to sort of rework everything for R5 necessarily. So I just have a bit of a show and tell, I think, in terms of the specifications. So I'll just bring up what the core spec looks like. So I'm expecting most of you, although maybe not everyone, has looked at the HL7 core specification. So this is the FHIR specifications R4 version. So primarily there's so just to show the sort of history, this is R4 version, but if we actually go through into the history of the spec, we can actually see there's a actual quite long history. There's even sort of versions here, and then into the actual managed versions that was run through the standards process. So we've kind of got historical material here running through time. So this is actually, it kind of captures the history. You can see sort of the dates, sort of 2011, 2012 were the first conceptual things, and then into actual standards work into sort of 2012 onwards. And then at the moment we've got an R4 and R4B release. So these are kind of where we're working at the moment, and we can see that R5 has also now been released sort of earlier this year. So one of the things, so basically these versions live into the future. So when we say R4, there is actually a specific R4 release. So the material it can be built against that particular version. There's one for 4B and there's one for R5 as well. But as well as obviously those stable versions that systems and implementations are built around, there is also a working version of the specification. So there is a current build of the specification. So this is where changes and any updates are happening, which is essentially the work going on in between decisions being made and new publications being made. So if you want to really see the latest and greatest of anything, it's here in this constant integration build. The continuous integration build. So it is something that you may have interest in, especially if you're working on standards in the specification. We're doing Australian work here, but it's really important to sort of look at the international work and see what's happening. With the specification, it is possible to raise issues directly against the specification. So you can actually go ahead and if you have issues or there's things that are missing that you think should be there, it is quite feasible and normal to raise an issue against the core specification and say, I don't like how this is modeled, and things like that. And pretty much they become things that are triaged and looked at by everyone in international to decide if that makes sense or there's an issue there. Certainly, it's worthwhile also looking at the history of all of that, because some of the decisions have also been made in the past to go one way or another. So it is something that, but you may come across things where you go, the core specification is not really suitable for some reason or some purpose or some usage, and that's often really good feedback into the international specification. Honestly, that's probably the best place to get a change made, because it means it's going to flow down into future versions of FHIR, and that's helpful. So rather than having to sort of work around issues in the FHIR specification, by adding our own versions of things to support particular cases, you can actually get them fixed right at the source. So it's actually a very worthwhile exercise. So that's kind of so with the FHIR specification as well. This is going to be a pretty brief and high level sort of walkthrough, but there's many resources to find. So there's essentially a lot of different purposes. Some of them are for building actual concepts to help support structure and definition in FHIR itself. So being able to do things like define clinical terminology, being able to define profiles of use, like we do in the Australian standards, to say here's an Australian type patient. So there needs to be a way to describe those rules and definitions. I'll probably do a session specifically on that later, but that's sort of some key stuff that exists that's not really clinical or administrative data. It's more just how the FHIR framework hangs together. And then there's essentially a whole heap of very useful resource definitions. So you have useful things like patients and practitioners, and then into clinical material as well. So there's obviously a pretty broad scope of clinical sort of types of resources. Each of them has their own definition and content. At some stage too, we may go through some of the clinical things in more detail, especially as we work through those things in future sessions. Work through that with the AU core work. There's a lot of things to learn in terms of different areas. Pretty much, I know about some of it. Other people know about other bits. So it gets pretty vast, and there's a lot of material to know. So I think as much as anything, it's good to know the right people that know different areas, because there's definitely plenty of material here. So this sort of goes through health record material on into other useful, billing, financial concerns, and also more into the reporting and definitional space where, there's things like summary reports and being able to define metrics and things like that, as well as a whole area of endeavour. So with that, so basically, that's resources. So these are data-oriented content. But of course, with that, it's necessary to be able to do something with the data. So as well as the data definitions and sort of having this data available, there's also how to interact with the data. So one of the sort of core things I'll just point out, there's actually a bunch of material there, but one of the useful things to look at is the API concepts for FHIR. So this sort of goes through how to manage data life cycles. So things like being able to create data, search, read, and useful things to do with data. So there's a bit of detail in that. So we'll go through that at some point in the future. But the main thing is that it's a standard approach to the FHIR resources, and the ability to be able to, excuse me, be able to being able to interact with the data. So a lot of there's the core sort of management of the life cycle of the data in terms of being able to create, read, update, delete the core things, and then being able to do search sort of concepts as well. We're searching by elements or searching by different criteria to be able to locate the things you want to locate. That's a standard approach applied across all resources. So the useful thing is that it's a very consistent method of being able to define those things. I think we won't talk too much about it. We'll talk about that a little bit in a high level, but that's a more detailed session as well. That's probably good for a start. So looking at the core specification, we can we'll take an old chestnut, which is the patient resource, and so every resource has essentially a definition which is similar in structure, and provides sort of the background for why that resource exists. What sort of scope of data is it included in the definition, and how that might be useful to you. So primarily there's scope of use, how this relates to other things, and then actual onto definitional content. So I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of what's in a patient, but I'll just point at like the features of what is in a resource definition, because essentially we have the idea of a FHIR resource, which has some sort of common capability in terms of being able to be stored and found in systems and used and updated, and resources are made up of elements, and elements have data types attached to them. So there's some core data types in FHIR, which range from sort of regular sort of computing data types, which are things like booleans and date times and strings and integers, and then into more specific healthcare related FHIR sort of data types, with things like identifier, human name, contact point, which is more like a communications contact point, things like codable concept, which are sort of terminology related material. So every resource is built up of these elements and the structure, and being able to define a resource in detail, and with any sort of model of data, it has useful things like the cardinality of the entity item element. So I can have 0 up to many identifiers. I can have 1 active 0, 1 active status, and you can do things like having choices as well between different types. So here I've got a choice of a deceased flag, a yes no deceased, or a yes no date of deceased date. So you can sort of see that it's built up on having these elements defining the scope and definition of the data, and being able to then define that as being sort of a standard way of representing a patient. There's one of the other interesting things is binding of terminology. So you can see things here like gender. Gender is just a coded value. There's a required binding to a known standard set. So this is actually built into the FHIR patient, and there's essentially a defined set of allowed values here, right? So now this is, sometimes this is a place where people might argue. The bindings in FHIR range from being required to being other levels. So there is the ability to say a terminology. Say for marital status, there is a set, but it's also extensible. So which means you can add extra codes to it, and there's other sort of levels of binding as well, which probably are more relevant when we talk about AU base. And primarily you'll see, if you go down this list, there are very few elements that are actually mandatory in any of these FHIR specifications. So we go through and you go, oh, identify is optional, name's optional, telecommunication details like emails and phone is optional, gender is optional. So if you actually look through this, there's actually very few elements at a core that are actually needed. In fact, in patient, there's none at the top level that are actually required. So which is, whilst it's a, that seems not very useful in the sense that there's no rules there, it does make it super flexible. So this is, this patient definition is reusable in a lot of different cases. A de-identified patient, and depending on the situation, you can apply this resource pattern, and you can get a result. I should point out too, there is sort of, as well as the top level elements, there's essentially tree-like structure. So there's these backbone elements that let you build up trees of information. So here we've, say, got contact details in a group that gets repeated as well. So there is the ability to build essentially a hierarchy of structure, and being able to define that. One of the other core, as well as the core data types, there is a useful concept of referring to other resources. So obviously we can do things like, so what's a good example? Say the general practitioner for this patient. So if you have a nominated primary care providers is one of the things that's supported. You can reference out to either an organisation, an individual, or individual in a role, directly. So this sort of links out to the other resource types and being able to build up then a model where things are related to each other. So pretty much all resources will refer to other resources. Generally speaking, a lot of clinical data is referring to patient, and because there's patient is the subject of that data, and also there's the medico-legal sort of material of knowing where things happened and who did what in terms of the history. So there is a lot of support for those things. So I've done. That's a pretty high level, but it's just there is structure, and it is all based on standard types and things like that. So whilst I say, that's how patient works, if I go into, say, any other resource, so allergy intolerance, you'll see primarily it's operating in a similar fashion in terms of how it's structured, the structured information, standard data types, references to other things. And there's essentially a standard model built up that people have worked on to be agreeable to most cases. And and so as well as the data side of things, there's terminology that's relevant. So we talked a little bit about that relevant terminology that's defined. One of the other sort of core things probably to note, there's a lot of stuff in patient about how to use it. But every resource generally will have a search parameter section as well, which sort of lets you know how what are the standard ways that this resource can be searched for. So some of the elements contained will have support for a standard FHIR search. So these are things we typically expect might be available to you on the interface, and being able to search by these things. So for patient, there's like a pretty comprehensive list of different ways to search for them and based on different criteria. And that's applying the sort of standard search FHIR approaches. But the thing is too, like this is what you would, if you say pick up a standard FHIR server off the shelf, so go and get your Happy FHIR server, or your Smile CDR, or your Microsoft, or your AWS, or whatever brand of FHIR server you get off the shelf. Pretty much all these searches will always be implemented. These are standard searches that we expect to be built on every full FHIR server implementation. So it does give you standard capability that you can get from a standard FHIR server around this. If you're building interfaces into legacy systems, there's actually a lot of work in implementing these searches. So typically speaking, we'll probably be talking about priority items. So when we get into AU Core, there'll be some searches we consider more important than others, and we'll probably be defining which ones those are, so that we can help people that are building not against a general server, but a FHIR server, but have to build out all the search capability against another database or another system, set of information, being able to implement the key things, which kind of gives us a basis of knowing what systems can do and help us build out a useful set of material. So that's probably enough on that one. Were there any questions on that one?
I have one question. Is there a way to identify, or an easy way to identify, changes that would in AU base or AU core that would be kind of breaking from lower versions?
Sure. Yeah. So there is. Yeah, that's good. I might just flick, because that's pretty much for the core spec. Yeah, I'll flick to AU base and talk a bit about that. AU base has probably had the most development over time in terms of content and material. The important thing to note, and actually this is probably worth pointing out in the core spec as well, is that each resource definition actually has a maturity level attached to it. So this is actually a way to understand where changes can be expected and what is needed by people implementing. So when I say R4 of FHIR, there is a specific definition of what R4 for FHIR is. So if you have a server or a system that's purporting to do R4, there really is only one way to implement it. It is against that specific specification. So if there's an R5 client trying to connect to an R4 system, there will be differences and there will be things to think about. So you kind of need to know which version of FHIR is being provided by any particular implementation. And if you are the implementer of the interface, you need to be able to know exactly what you're implementing. So that will be a specific version of something, right? So if you want to actually say what do, you can validate against a specific version and know that you are valid against it. So say we look at the patient resource, there's essentially a set of maturity levels which range from very drafty, like these are essentially untested artifacts, up to they're essentially approved. there's draft, and then there's no errors. Is sort of the next level, and then we've got things where with the actual committees have approved the content, things are tested. There's kind of this idea of running things through connectathon processes, and basically there's criteria to be met at each level. And then once you reach this level 6, you get marked with a normative level. Now, and normative gives you some guarantees in terms of how the backwards compatibility works going forward. So if I say look at patient in the core specification, it's at a normative level, which means I can expect patient to be the same. So patient was actually normative in R4, so it is the same in R5, right? So it'll be backwards compatible in R5, right? So the elements may be added, but there won't be any changes to the elements you already know and love. So if you've implemented R4 of the patient FHIR specification, you'll be also compatible for R5. But if I say pick another resource type, and you can see actually there's a number against each of these resources, that's actually indicating their maturity level. Whilst this gives some indication it may change in future versions, in this particular version it's going to be the same, right? R4 is R4, R5 is R5, and systems can essentially work against those specifically, but the maturity level gives you some indication that there may be changes to this specification, but obviously the higher the number, the less likely there are to be changes. So I can say like practitioners at level 5, so it's not normative yet, but I'm not actually expecting a lot of change there. Whereas I look at something like organization affiliation, which is like a brand new resource type, I don't even know what that does. So that kind of gives you it's at level 1. So I kind of expect there'll be development of that through the committee process, and things will change. And what we're trying to do with AU base is and AU core as well will be the same. Is we try and do the same sort of things with that in terms of giving it a maturity rating. So if I look at AU base patient, this has gone through some cycles, has been trialed quite a lot. We've got it set at maturity level 3, which is sort of in the middle in terms of usage and things like that. There's probably potential that this could be higher right now, but we're kind of pretty conservative in terms of bumping that up. So we've kind of so basically there's some formalizing of that down to a more stable level. And the thing with AU base as well is obviously there's patient details there, but with AU base, we bring in a lot more other useful things that we need to represent in Australian context. So FHIR has extensions which let us extend with concepts that aren't supported directly in the patient sort of specification. So as far as knowing what's changed, the maturity level indicates likelihood of change, and we are now much more formally trying to do mappings back to things. So the difficulty in this sort of model is that there's aspects and parts of it that are at different levels. So I can say I don't expect things like a Medicare number representation to change. It's at a quite high maturity level, but there might be new things. We are sort of doing stuff with private insurer numbers as well, and that might be something that's less mature. So there may be changes. So whilst that is true, there are versions of AU base as well and AU core. So there will be specific. There is a history, and same as our core specification. So basically, we've got a stable version, which is essentially our 4.1 version, which is a published one. That's actually gone through a balloting process, so it's been reviewed, and ballot comments have come back, and things have been approved there. So it's quite feasible to say I implement 4.1 of AU base, and that means you're following that specific pattern of use, and for systems, for negotiations between systems, that's probably the best way to go, is to actually have an identified stable version, preferably one that's been balloted and approved, because we do have sort of preview versions and things in between, snapshots for trialing and doing things like that. But there are ones that are balloted and approved. So we've gone through cycles. So we've gone through like 2 cycles of balloting and approvals for AU base. So there's some stability and review in that content. However, we do continue work. So we do continue to try and work on things as well. So add more material and do things like correct any errors. But we are looking at backwards compatibility issues as we go as well. So we're attempting to not introduce backwards compatibility problems. But because of the maturity level of the content, we won't really guarantee no backwards compatibility problems until it's at normative level. So I think we're still in a maturity cycle in terms of bringing that stuff up to being completely known. And so I think that primarily it'd be more just pointing in a particular version, saying that's what we're going to apply in the business that we're running right now. And that might be national business or it might be local connections. But that gives you a sort of a framework to at least know what the rules are that are being applied, and there's a recognized set of artifacts and being able to validate against them. Yeah. Is that a fair enough answer?
Thank you.
Hi, Brett. I have a question.
Yeah.
It's in regards to AU base and AU core. The AU base description talks about if there's any implementation to be done to use the AU core. So when to use AU base, when to use AU core, when we have to implement. It seems to me that there's some overlap, and I understand that AU base could be a historical thing before AU core came,
I could tell you, because there's a and this is probably the bit that raises a lot of questions. So it's AU base is initially AU base was set out to really define useful concepts that we could reuse. It's not necessarily designed to be directly implemented, and I'll show you kind of why with the patient resource. I'll just at a high level go through and go, we've sort of got Australian versions of a bunch of different resources. And the main thing there is to sort of say, at a high level, the core specifications don't do things like say this is the correct terminology to use. So say we have prescribing data. It doesn't say to use one sort of drug terminology or another, right? And in Australia, we have a set of terminologies that are sort of recognised as being typical ways that things are done. So part of what we do is try and identify those and say, in Australian context, it makes sense to use these things, and this is how you represent them. We do other useful things like define. We've got a bunch of identifier types, right? So we have a bunch of sort of local identifiers that we commonly used throughout Australian context, things like IHI and HPO and all these things. A Medicare number is often used as an identifier, and you can sort of see there's a whole bunch here of different things. So one of the things we wanted to do is sort of have definitions that sort of say, in an Australian context, like, because I could go and take a FHIR identifier type and I could represent IHI in a lot of different ways. So I could say, well, mine says a type says IHI in text and I have a value of IHI, right? But that's not very helpful for interoperability because we can't, unless we have an agreement on how that's done, it's pretty hard to know your IHI looks different than my IHI definition. So what we did was actually formalize a lot of things. It include like IHIs, an interesting case. We sort of have a sort of a national structure. It applies, the actual digit checks. We've even got implementation. We've even got implementation of the checksum built in and things like that into our definition. So it's actually like a quite good formal definition of getting a valid IHI content sort of there. We have sort of we've approved the use of particular URLs to identify the system. So you can actually say you're sure this is an IHI. This is come from the Digital Health Agency, but that we're essentially bringing that through into the specifications, and we've done useful things like extend it to include some IHI status context and things like that. So like that's like one case, but we sort of have taken that to be able to say this is how we do IHI in Australia. So say we take patient, because that's not a bad. It's not a bad example. So like in patient, we do some, like say in identifiers slot, we've sort of got, these are the data types we kind of, we say make sense for a patient. So these are the sort of patient identifiers. In practitioner, we have a set of practitioner identifiers. In practitioner role, we have practitioner role identifiers. So we've sort of got this model that's sort of helping people hopefully say, where should the identifiers go? How should they be structured? And AU-based does that, right? So, but what AU-based doesn't do is say you have to have an identifier. It doesn't say doesn't say you have to have a Medicare number. So it's very much still, everything's pretty much optional. Still, right? So as a spec for interoperability, it's telling you how to do things, but it's not telling you what you must do, right? So AU base is kind of giving you a framework of how to represent things well, and AU core will move up to the next level, which is actually saying these are the rules we need to apply to be able to say we can generally communicate with each other. So typically it'll be so say I take AU core patient, and this is very much draft materials, level 0, because it hasn't really been approved by anyone. With AU core, we'll see that we're doing all the things AU base does. We still have the same identifiers and things that are available. But what we have done is we put a rule saying you have to supply one of these, and other things like you have to have a name included and a gender and a birth date, right? So it's these are kind of then asserting things must be present. you know, in terms of the cardinality rules. So that, and this is all up for discussion. So you might disagree, whatever, but that's where the discussion will happen. And one of the other things you'll see is S's down the page here. That's a concept called must support. And what must support does is kind of indicate you may have optional elements, say address, right? Here you go. So address is optional, so you don't need to have an address. If you don't have an address, there's no address there, right? But it's expected that most systems will be able to support adding an address and also consuming an address. So these are things we kind of expect. All systems should expect this material to come to them. So you shouldn't fall over. If there's an address there, you shouldn't go reject because I'm not expecting an address. So it's kind of indicating things we expect. It's really highlighting the importance of some of the elements and trying to say we kind of think this is a common level that systems will communicate. And again, this is all up for grabs in terms of defining what the rules actually are. But what we're aiming for, and this is kind of based on some international projects as well, is like things that we can generally expect from most systems. So when you say I implement AU Core, I know you'll likely fill in these things, and I can then build my systems to communicate with them. And as a consumer of AU Core, you know, basically, if I was a consumer, I would only care about these things probably, and anything else is sort of outside of what AU Core defines. So this is not everything a patient has in its record, but it is, you know, this is a set that we're kind of indicating is one level to operate at. And that's really the difference. So AU base kind of defines the content that's useful and how to represent it, and AU Core will actually put some rules on to say this is our sort of expectation between systems. So AU base is really good for building other specifications, and AU Core is implementable, right? So it's
makes sense.
So it's also like the things, you know, Australian sort of content. We have a bunch of extensions, so we've kind of got things and some of these are sort of, there are international extensions, but we've sort of got local ones as well. So Indigenous status is a good one. That's a very common thing to have in an Australian patient health record, but doesn't exist as such in a patient resource. So there's no element that really supports that concept very well. So we've added a specific extension which sort of says we have a coded Indigenous status that we can include, and that means systems sharing Indigenous status will do it the same way. So we kind of can support those common things. You know, and in AU Core, we've kind of highlighted that as something we kind of expect systems to do. Back in AU base, it's just like these are some options, and you see there's things here. We kind of highlighted things we typically expect systems would do in Australia, and these are the extensions we recommend for that business. But we don't say you have to, right? So there's no actual specific rules here, but it is useful for AU Core, because AU Core we say, oh, Indigenous status can be represented this way, and in AU Core we say, yeah, you have to support it, right? And you know, depending on the use case, you might decide that it's mandatory, right? So, but the AU Core doesn't say that, but it might say, yeah, that's the kind of thing where you can build up the rules later. So at the moment, like a lot of work's been done with AU Core. There's extensions defined, and there's useful things like that. One of the big things is probably communication is a good place to look. We do bindings to local terminologies. So this is kind of really important for getting the knowledge transfer and interoperability, is to be able to say the terminologies that are appropriate any element. So in the core specification, there's no particular sort of definition of, say, like, you know, like this is like language spoken information. There's no particular terminology that's applied or is required by the FHIR core specification. So we've defined one that's suitable, and we've said, yeah, you should apply this, basically. You can extend it, but you should apply it. And this is actually linking out into the National Clinical Terminology material as well. So this is like a managed terminology, oh, something's broken. Oh no, that's the way you said there. So oh yeah, that's a tricky one. That one's not actually an expandable one. Relation type, that's a different one. So yeah, so like example, there's basically there's managed terminology included in the system. So part of the work that we do as well is identifying the terminology that's appropriate and saying where can it be applied in the specifications. In AU base, we kind of live mainly at a level of going, we recommend things, to be used terminology wise, but then we'll take it up to a higher level, probably with core. Core will probably say you have to use this terminology in this element. But again, this is all for discussion, right? So I think, yeah, the AU core work will probably look at what's in AU base. Definitely, you can see in AU core, it's actually, there's this kind of idea of it being derived from AU base. So we take AU base as a given. So an AU core patient should pass the AU base rules, but it will also have its own rules that adds in. So you add in some extra level of things. Yeah. So I think, yeah, hopefully, yeah, it makes more sense. But the good news is we're not coming at it from a completely blank slate in terms of material. There's plenty of material and actually a lot of implementations already using AU-based content and methodologies. So I think it's something that I think it's more what are people prepared to implement is more the question for AU core. So so it's very much going to come back to the vendors and go, this is what we're prepared to do. And if there's a problem, right? So basically, if you say we can't do this because of whatever reason, I think that'll be the discussion we kind of have. And the idea is that we work on the definitions, build systems, connect them together in connectathons, prove that it works, and then we can move on to a higher level of saying we're agreed, and then we move on and the idea at the end of the day is to have a version that is balloted and people say this is now a base level thing that we all agree, right? And we can then say that's how it's done, and move forward after that. Anyway, perfect. I can see I have run into time, so I covered some of the things I thought I would cover. But yeah, feel free to drop off if you need to go, but I'm happy to take questions further if people have more.
Thanks, Brett. Yeah, that was clear. Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
Hi, Brett. Quick question about the first slide that you showed around how we've sort of inherited from the international standard and from the AU base. And then in parallel, there's like an R5 that's currently being developed on an international level. And at some point, we see Australia going there. The question is that as we're developing AU core R4, will some of the work that we're doing with R5 flow into R4? Definitely. Or is it going to be, let's develop R4 to what's currently mature and then move to R5?
Yeah, I think there's definitely will be some of the flow, like basically a lot of the work we're doing in AU core will be conceptual, and we're actually saying how, what do we represent, how do we represent it, and things like that. As we move into R5, a lot of those definitions will automatically be able to be represented exactly the same in R5. Okay, there won't be changes in R5 that affect the content. Yep. So we'll be able to move that material. We obviously then are looking at if there's breaking change. It's essentially if we have definitions on patient, because the core specification for patient is normative, there won't be any changes. There won't be any breaking changes because in fact, all the things we use to define the rules and all the things we use the patient has already structured in the FHIR core specification will be the same. So we can happily move up to the next version, and because patient hasn't changed, the original core patient, we won't need to change anything. If we have resources though that the underlying definitions have changed, so element names change or things move around or they're restructured in some way, then we'll definitely need to assess that and say how do we move from the R4 version of that to the R5 version of that. That will be a systematic process though, and we already have had some experience with AU Base of going from the STU3 version to the R4 version as a sort of different FHIR version. And it's mainly the things that mostly it'll be apparent because you'll go, this element has now disappeared, been renamed. As you go, there's actually a formal mapping definition from R4 to R5 as well. So FHIR has published that. So, you know, if you've put rules on a particular element, you can see that element's changed in the way or its nature in how it's done. So it's something, there'll be a formal review of those things, but conceptually we'll move everything up, right? So we'll still want to represent all the same concepts. So there may be changes, but probably less changes than you think is probably the short answer. And some of that is just that, some of that it'll almost entirely be based on underlying changes between the FHIR resource definitions from one version to the other, which means that everybody is doing that in the world that needs to be able to do that. So yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Recordings, yes, we will make recordings available in general. So we will work out where we publish that, but probably we'll I'll send that out on the list anyway, wherever they end up. But we'll probably put that up on the Confluence site to be accessible. Cool. Any last questions? My half an hour ran into 55 minutes, so that was pretty typical for me. But it's yeah. So, but yeah. Hopefully, hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour anyway. And give you some idea, like when we talk about these specs, what that means. Yeah, I think hopefully this is going to be a monthly thing. If you do have any ideas for topics, let me know. I will collate them, and we'll probably just keep going. I know there's part of the reason these sessions are happening is that everybody wants to get into the training courses but can't get in because they're so popular. So I think people are working on getting more availability of the training stuff, but in the absence of that, this is I guess a bit of a show and tell and a bit of a high level sort of coverage of things. So hopefully it fills some of the gap there, and I think it's a very nice forum to get together, and and obviously some subjects may be more important to you than others. I expect initially we're probably going to be talking a lot about implementation, understanding the specs and how to build some of how to work on the core, how to work on the standards, because we're really keen on getting AU core and things happening in terms of people contributing. But I expect at some point we'll move on to some more hardcore, maybe some hardcore issues in terms of building IGs and things like that. Hopefully, so if you're into the business of actually building your own implementation guides, there's stuff to know there as well. So I think it's as much as anything, it'd be nice to say who's doing what, and get those groups together, because you can all learn from each other, and we can all improve everything. Thank you. I might call an end. Thanks for coming. I wasn't expecting quite so many.
Thanks, Brett.
No,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Brett. It's been great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brett. Excellent work.
Thanks, Brett.
Good stuff. Thanks very much.
Bye now.